Okay, for this video, I wanted to talk about the procedures to change the responsible party for an entity after the initial filing of the EIN application. So for those of you familiar with this process, when you apply for an EIN for a company, on the EIN application, you have to designate a responsible party. So it's a natural person, meaning it's an individual, and generally it's the person that owns and controls the company. Now the IRS defines it a little more precisely, and they say, well, the responsible party is the person who has a level of control over or entitlement to the funds, assets in the entity that, as a practical matter, enables that individual directly or indirectly to control, manage, or direct the entity and the disposition of those funds and assets. So it's quite a mouthful. What are they meaning there? Well, they're just asking who is the beneficial owner that controls the company, right? So if you're the 100% owner of an LLC or the 100% owner of a corporation, you are the responsible party, okay? So if the EIN responsible party differs at any point after the initial application, then you need to change it, right? So for example, if you apply for an EIN for a newly formed LLC and you had one responsible party and then there was a change in ownership, you've got to update those records within 60 days of the change. Now, here's where I see this all too often, and it's wrong, and I try to encourage people not to do this, but it's with nominee EIN applications, right? So for example, if John Doe is a citizen and tax resident of Germany and he opens a Delaware LLC, John doesn't have a U.S. tax ID, which means that he can get an EIN for his Delaware entity, but he has to submit it via paper. So SS4 is filed via paper, U.S. mail, or you can fax it. Now, instead of doing that, John says, well, I have a friend in Florida who's a U.S. citizen, and he has a Social Security number, so why don't I just have my Florida friend apply for the EIN on behalf of the LLC as a nominee? Here's the issue. The IRS has explicitly stated that nominees used to obtain EINs is not appropriate. You are not supposed to do this, okay? So if John is the 100% owner and his friend has no involvement in the U.S. LLC whatsoever, his friend should not be being the one applying for that EIN. It needs to be John, okay? And the other issue here is once that application is submitted, the IRS thinks that single member LLCs, if we use John's friend for example, they think John's friend is the owner. So if you apply for an EIN for a single member LLC and you're using a nominee, the confirmation letter that gets sent out, the CP 575 notice, it's going to have the nominee's name on the letter because the IRS thinks the nominee is the owner. And why should they think any differently? They've told people do not use nominees for the EIN applications, and so it's appropriate for the IRS to assume that you followed those rules and you did not use a nominee to apply for the EIN. Now, if you went down this path because you didn't get the right advice, you can fix this, right? So if you had a nominee apply for an EIN on your behalf, you can change the responsible party, and you should do so immediately. In order to change that responsible party, you file Form 8822B. Now, this form can also be used to change the address for the business, the physical location for the business. But in our case here, we're only going to be filing it to change the responsible party name and tax ID number. All the address information can remain the same. So if we look at the 8822B here, we have change of address or responsible party for a business. So the first few fields we're filling out here, pretty straightforward. We are checking that we are changing the employment, excise, income, and other business return addresses, or not in this case addresses, but responsible party information. So the business location is not changing. We don't have any employee plan returns, so we are just updating box 1 here. We can put down the business name, the EIN, those are obvious. Line 6 and 7, there are no changes here, right? So 5, old mailing address, 6, new mailing address, business location. All of that information that we submitted on the initial application is remaining the same. Now, if there was a change in one of these elements, then you would provide that information. So if there was a change in address, put the old address, put the new address. But in our case, we're just changing the name of the responsible party. So on line 8 here, remember our friend John here, he set up the entity, but then he had his friend in Florida be the initial responsible party. So we're moving it back to John Doe, the German citizen and tax resident. So he is the new responsible party. And then his SSN, ITIN, or EIN, in our case, he does not have either of those. So we put foreign US, which is the appropriate placeholder to indicate that this individual does not have a US tax ID number, and that's okay. Then, under the signature field, we have John Doe sign this, and he indicates his title there as the managing member, which is the case, right? He owns 100% of the company. He is the managing member of the LLC, so he would sign as such. So John prints this, signs, dates it, and then he mails it to the appropriate IRS location depending on where the entity was set up and where the mailing address is set up. So if John set up this Delaware LLC and he had a Delaware mail forwarding address, he would use this section up here, IRS Service Center in Kansas City. Now realistically, you can send it to either one and they will process it, but we're supposed to be following, their directions as far as where to send it. So follow the directions to the T to the extent you can. So in this case, if you have a Delaware entity, send it to the IRS in Kansas City. Okay? All right, so that covers it for the change to responsible party issue. I hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions, please leave me a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next video. Thank you.